70 years old, you expect a quiet life. You expect to grow old with the person you love. You do not expect your husband of 40 years to start sneaking out of the house. But 3 weeks ago, that is exactly what my husband, Edward, started doing. Every single night, when the clock struck midnight, he would slip out of bed. He would put on his heavy winter coat, step outside into the thick fog, and vanish. He would not return until 3 in the morning. He was always exhausted. He was always completely silent. I couldn't live with the lies anymore. I kept my shoes on under the covers last night. When he walked out, I followed him deep into the forest behind our house. I thought I would find another woman. Instead, I found him on his knees in a ruined cabin, crying and digging a deep hole in the dirt. What lay at the bottom of that hole made my blood run cold. Before I tell you the terrifying truth of what was hidden in that dirt, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow. And please comment below to tell me where you are watching this video from. I truly enjoy seeing where everyone is from. Let's head back into those dark woods. The human mind is a strange thing. When you love someone for 40 years, you build a structure of trust. You think that structure is made of solid stone. You believe nothing can knock it down. But doubt is like water. It finds the tiniest crack. It seeps in slowly. If you do not stop it, it freezes and splits the stone wide open. That Tuesday night was the beginning of the crack. Edward and I had a beautiful evening. We ate a simple dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables. We sat on the porch and watched the sunset. The sky was a mix of deep purple and bright orange. Edward held my hand. His skin was rough from years of working in his woodshop, but his touch was always gentle. "You look beautiful tonight, Clara," he whispered to me. I smiled at him. I felt safe. I felt incredibly lucky. We watched a little television, and then we went to bed at our usual time, 10 o'clock. When I woke up at midnight, the silence in the house was heavy. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. I looked at his side of the bed. The blankets were tossed aside. When I heard the front door click, my heart skipped a beat. It was a physical pain in my chest. I ran to the window. Seeing him walk down the street felt like watching a stranger. He did not walk with his usual slow, dignified pace. He walked quickly. He kept his head down. He looked like a man who was running away from something, or a man who was running towards something he shouldn't. I stayed awake for the next 3 hours. I sat in the armchair in the corner of the bedroom. The room was dark. Every minute felt like an entire day. My mind raced with terrible thoughts. We live in a quiet, rural town. There are not many places to go at midnight. The diner closes at 9. The grocery store closes at 10. There are only houses, fields, and the thick woods at the edge of our property. Where could an elderly man be going on foot at this hour? At exactly 3:15, I heard the front door open again. I leaped from the chair and scrambled into bed. I pulled the covers up to my chin. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to become slow and regular. The bedroom door pushed open. Edward stepped inside. He moved like a ghost. He took off his heavy coat and hung it in the closet. When he pulled back the covers and lay down, the bed shook slightly. He was trembling. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and scream. I wanted to ask him where he had been, but fear held me paralyzed. I was terrified of what the answer might be. I lay there in the dark, staring at the wall, until the sun came up. The next morning was agonizing. The sun was bright, and the birds were singing outside the kitchen window. Everything looked normal. The coffee pot was brewing. The smell of toasted bread filled the air. Edward sat at the kitchen table. He was reading the local newspaper. He looked incredibly tired. There were dark, heavy bags under his eyes. His hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee mug to his lips. "Did you sleep well, dear?" I asked. I tried to keep my voice casual. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Edward did not look up from the paper immediately. He cleared his throat. "Yes, Clara. I slept just fine. A bit of a stiff neck, but otherwise fine. How about you?" He looked me in the eyes. His eyes were pale blue. Usually, they were full of warmth and life, but today they looked dull. They looked guarded. He was lying to me. He looked right at me and lied. I woke up in the middle of the night, I said softly. I watched his face closely. I thought I heard a noise. I thought maybe you were up. Edward's hand froze for a split second. The newspaper rustled in his grip. Then he forced a small smile. No, I didn't hear anything. You must have been dreaming, Clara. You know how active your imagination can be. My stomach turned. He was covering his tracks. He was making me doubt my own senses. That afternoon, I decided to do some investigating. I waited until Edward went out to his woodshop in the backyard. Once I heard the familiar sound of his electric saw, I went into our bedroom. I opened the closet. I found his heavy winter coat. I reached into the deep pockets. My fingers brushed against something. I pulled it out. It was a small piece of paper. It was folded into a tiny square. I unfolded it with shaking fingers. There was no writing on it. It was a map. It was a hand-drawn map of the woods behind our house. There was a long, winding line that started at our property boundary. It led deep into the forest. At the very end of the line, there was a small, carefully drawn circle. Inside the circle, Edward had written a single letter, M. My mind went entirely blank. What did M stand for? Was it a name? Did he have someone waiting for him in the middle of the dark forest? It sounded absurd. We were in our 70s. But love and jealousy do not care about age. The pain of betrayal feels exactly the same whether you are 20 or 70. I put the map back in his pocket. I walked out of the closet and sat on the edge of the bed. I felt completely isolated. I wanted to call my daughter, but what would I tell her? That her sweet, grandfatherly father was sneaking into the woods at midnight? She would think I was losing my mind. I was completely on my own. I realized there was only one way to get the truth. I had to see it for myself. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety. Every single night, the routine was the same. Midnight would arrive. Edward would leave. 3 hours later, he would return. He became more withdrawn each day. He stopped talking during dinner. The silence in our home became deafening. Finally, I reached my breaking point. It was a Friday night. The weather forecast warned of heavy rain, but by 11 o'clock, it was just a thick, suffocating fog. We went to bed. Edward fell asleep quickly, or at least he pretended to. I lay beside him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had prepared myself. I wore dark pants and a thick black sweater. I placed my sturdiest walking shoes right under my side of the bed. The old grandfather clock in the living room began to chime. Dong, 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 12 times. Right on cue, Edward shifted. He threw off the blankets. He stood up smoothly, as if he hadn't been asleep at all. He dressed in the dark. I watched his dark silhouette move across the room. He grabbed his coat from the closet. Then he tiptoed out of the room. I waited. I heard his soft footsteps fade down the hallway. I heard the gentle click of the front door latch. I threw off my covers. I slipped my feet into my shoes and tied them quickly. I grabbed a small, heavy flashlight from my nightstand. I did not turn it on yet. I needed my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I walked out of the bedroom. I passed through the kitchen and went to the back door instead of the front. If Edward was going to the woods, he would likely cut through the backyard to avoid being seen on the main road. I opened the back door quietly. The night air hit my face. It was damp and cold. The fog was incredibly thick. It rolled across our lawn like white smoke. I could barely see past the old oak tree in the center of the yard. Then I saw a flash of light. It was faint, muffled by the fog. It was coming from the edge of the tree line. It was Edward. He had a flashlight of his own. He was pointing it down at the ground, guiding his steps into the brush. I squeezed my flashlight tightly. I took a deep breath. Please, God, I whispered to myself. Let me be wrong about him. I stepped out onto the wet grass. I followed him into the woods. The woods behind our house are dense. During the day, they are beautiful. Our grandchildren love to play near the edges. They look for deer and collect colorful leaves in the autumn. But at night, the woods turn into a completely different world. The trees look like giant, reaching arms. The shadows seemed to stretch and move. I stayed far behind Edward. I could only track him by the dim beam of his flashlight bouncing through the trees. The ground was rough. There were fallen branches, hidden rocks, and thick patches of briars. More than once I tripped. I nearly fell to my knees. I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out in pain. My old knees were throbbing. The cold air burned my lungs. But anger and desperation kept me moving forward. Edward moved with strange confidence. He knew exactly where he was going. He was following the path from his secret map. We walked deeper and deeper into the forest. I had lived on this property for 40 years, but I had never been this far into the woods. The trees grew closer together. The air felt heavier. It felt like we were miles away from civilization. Suddenly, the light ahead of me stopped moving. I froze behind a large pine tree. I pressed my back against the rough bark. I held my breath. I peeked around the trunk. Edward was standing in a small clearing. The fog was slightly thinner here. He raised his flashlight and shone it upward. The light illuminated the stone wall of an old, abandoned structure. It was a cabin. It was small, completely ruined, and covered in thick green ivy. The roof had collapsed inward decades ago. The wooden door was rotted and hanging from a single rusty hinge. It looked like a place that time had completely forgotten. Edward walked up to the ruined door. He pushed it open. It gave a loud, agonizing creak that echoed through the silent forest. He stepped inside, and the light from his flashlight disappeared into the structure. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would burst. This was it. This was the moment of truth. Was there a woman waiting for him inside that ruined cabin? Was this their secret meeting place? I squeezed my hands into fists. I could feel tears stinging my eyes. I did not want to look. I wanted to turn around and run back to my warm, safe bed. I wanted to pretend I never saw any of this. But I knew I could never go back to normal. I had to know. I stepped out from behind the pine tree. I crept toward the cabin. I moved as silently as a cat. I reached the stone wall. I pressed my ear against the cold, damp rock. At first, there was only silence. Then I heard a sound. It was not the sound of two people whispering. It was the sound of scraping metal. It sounded like someone was digging. I crept closer to the broken doorway. I peered through the gap in the wooden door. The inside of the cabin was a total mess. Discarded beams of wood and broken stone tiles covered the floor. Edward had set his flashlight on top of a crumbling stone fireplace. The beam pointed downward, lighting up the center of the room. Edward was on his knees in the dirt. He had a small gardening trowel in his hand. He was digging a hole in the earth near the base of the fireplace. He was working hard. He was panting heavily. Sweat was pouring down his face, despite the cold night air. Beside him on the ground lay a small, old wooden box. It looked like an old cigar box. It was bound with heavy twine. I watched in total confusion. He wasn't meeting anyone. He was alone. He was digging a hole in the middle of the night. Edward stopped digging. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. He picked up the wooden box. He held it in both hands. He did not open it. He just stared at it. His expression was a mix of intense sorrow and profound exhaustion. Then he did something that broke my heart. He pressed the box to his chest. He closed his eyes, and my strong, stoic husband began to weep. He didn't cry out loud. He just sobbed silently. His shoulders shook violently. The tears ran down his wrinkled cheeks and dripped onto the old wooden box. He looked so incredibly fragile. He looked like a man carrying a weight that was far too heavy for his old bones. I couldn't stay hidden anymore. Seeing his pain completely erased my anger. It erased my suspicion. It erased my jealousy. All I felt was an overwhelming wave of love and deep concern for my husband. I pushed the heavy door open. It banged against the stone wall. Edward jumped. He let out a sharp gasp. He scrambled backward in the dirt, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes from the sudden movement. "Who's there?" he cried out. His voice was cracked and trembling with absolute terror. I stepped into the light of the flashlight. I let my hands fall to my sides. "It's me, Edward," I said softly. My voice was gentle. "It's Clara." Edward stared at me. His mouth was slightly open. His pale blue eyes were wide with total disbelief. He looked around the ruined cabin, as if he expected someone else to appear. "Clara?" he whispered. What are you doing here? How did you get here?" "I followed you, Edward," I said. I walked over to him slowly. I knelt down in the dirt right beside him. I did not care about my clothes. I just wanted to be near him. "You have been leaving every night for 3 weeks. I was terrified. I thought, I didn't know what to think." Edward looked down at the wooden box in his lap. He covered it with his trembling hands. He looked incredibly ashamed. He could not look me in the eye. "I am so sorry, Clara," he choked out. "I never wanted you to see this. I never wanted you to find out about this place. I wanted to keep you safe from it." "Safe from what, Edward?" I asked. I reached out and gently placed my hand over his. His skin was freezing cold. "We have been married for 40 years. We have shared everything. What could be so terrible that you have to hide it from me in the middle of the night?" Edward let out a long, ragged breath. He looked up at me. The absolute despair in his eyes made me gasp. "Do you remember my brother, Michael?" he asked. My breath caught in my throat. Michael. Of course I remembered him. But Michael had been dead for 50 years. Edward had a younger brother. When Edward was 21 and Michael was 16, Michael went missing. It was the greatest tragedy of Edward's life. The entire town searched for weeks. They found absolutely nothing. Michael had vanished off the face of the earth. The grief had destroyed Edward's parents. It had left a permanent scar on Edward's soul. "Yes, Edward," I said carefully. "I know about Michael. But what does Michael have to do with this ruined cabin? What does he have to do with that box?" Edward lifted the box. With shaking fingers, he untied the heavy twine. He lifted the wooden lid. Inside the box was an old, tarnished silver pocket watch. It was attached to a broken chain. Beside the watch lay a small, rusty pocket knife with a carved wooden handle. I recognized that handle. Edward had an identical one in his woodshop. He had carved them himself when he was a young man. One for him and one for his little brother. "These were Michael's," I whispered. Edward nodded. A fresh tear ran down his cheek. "Yes, they were his." "Where did you find them, Edward?" Edward pointed a trembling finger down at the earth beneath our knees. "Right here," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. 3 weeks ago, I was walking the property line. I wandered a bit further than usual. I found this old cabin. I came inside out of curiosity. Right there, near the hearth, I saw something shiny sticking out of the dirt. He swallowed hard. It was the silver chain of the watch. I dug it out. I found the knife right next to it. Clara, this was Michael's secret hiding spot. He used to come here to read and get away from the world. He told me about it once, but I forgot. I looked at the box and then I looked at the deep hole Edward had been digging. A cold dread began to settle in my stomach. "Edward," I said. My voice was shaking now. "If his watch and his knife are here, where is Michael?" Edward did not answer with words. He just looked down at the hole. I leaned forward. I picked up the flashlight from the mantelpiece and pointed the beam directly into the pit Edward had dug. The hole was deep. It was nearly 3 feet down. At the very bottom, sticking out from the dark, damp earth was something white. It was smooth. It didn't look like a rock. It didn't look like a root. It was a bone. A human bone. I pulled my hand back. I gasped and dropped the flashlight. It rolled in the dirt, its beam cutting across the ruined walls of the cabin. "Oh my God!" I breathed. I covered my mouth with both hands. "Oh my God, Edward!" "He never ran away, Clara," Edward said. His voice was completely broken now. He was crying openly. "He didn't abandon us. He came here. 50 years ago, he came to his secret spot. The roof. Look at the heavy stone beams. One of them must have collapsed back then. It must have hit him. He was trapped under the debris. Nobody knew he was here. He died here, all alone in the dark." The horror of the realization washed over me. For 50 years, Edward's little brother had been lying in the dirt just a mile from our house. While we raised our children, while we lived our lives, Michael was here. But Edward, I said, trying to understand. Why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you tell me the moment you found him? Edward grabbed my hands. He squeezed them with desperate strength. Because of my father, Clara, Edward cried. Do you remember what my father said before he died? He spent his whole life believing Michael ran away because he hated him. He died with a broken heart, full of guilt. If I go to the police now, it becomes a crime scene. They will dig him up. There will be an investigation. The whole town will talk. They will say I should have found him sooner. They will blame my family. He looked at the hole with an expression of intense love and protection. I couldn't let them turn Michael into a spectacle, Edward whispered. I couldn't let his memory be dragged through the mud. I wanted to give him a proper burial myself. I wanted to dig him out, bring him to the family cemetery plot under the cover of night, and lay him to rest next to our parents. I wanted to do it quietly. I have been coming here every night, digging with this little trowel, trying to free his bones without breaking them. It takes so long, Clara. It takes so long because I have to be so careful. I looked at my husband. He was not a liar. He was not a criminal. He was just a boy who had lost his brother 50 years ago, and he was still trying to bring him home. He was carrying a mountain of grief all by himself. I looked down at the bone in the dirt. Then I looked at the small gardening trowel. I reached out and took the trowel from Edward's hand. He looked at me in surprise. You are not doing this alone anymore, Edward, I said softly. I wiped the tears from his face with my sleeve. We are a team. We have been a team for 40 years. If we are going to bring Michael home, we are going to do it together. Edward stared at me for a long moment. Then he threw his arms around my neck. He buried his face in my shoulder and wept. I held him tightly in the ruins of that old cabin, surrounded by the fog and the ghosts of the past. We spent the next week working together. Every night at midnight, Edward and I walked into the woods. We didn't sneak anymore. We walked side by side, holding hands. We brought larger tools, but we worked with absolute gentleness. It was grueling work for two elderly people. My back ached terribly. Edward's hands were covered in blisters. But we did not complain. We worked in total silence, driven by a deep sense of duty and love. Slowly, carefully, we uncovered Michael's remains. We wrapped them in a beautiful, soft white blanket that I had brought from the house. We placed his silver pocket watch and his carved wooden knife inside the blanket with him. On the 8th night, the task was finally finished. The hole was empty. Michael was free from the dark cabin. We carried him back to our house under the moonlight. We placed him in the back of our truck. We drove to the Old Town Cemetery. It was a small, historic graveyard on a hill. Edward's parents were buried there, under a large weeping willow tree. There was a small, empty space right between their two headstones. We dug a new grave in the quiet hours before dawn. The earth was soft and cooperative. We lowered the blanket containing Michael's remains into the ground. Edward stood at the edge of the grave. He looked up at the stars. The sky was beginning to turn a pale, beautiful pink. The night was finally ending. You're home, Mikey, Edward said softly. Mom and Dad are right here. You don't have to be alone in the dark anymore. We covered the grave with earth and smoothed it over. We placed a small, flat stone on top. Edward used his wood-carving tools to etch a simple name into the stone. Michael. As we drove back to our house, the sun finally broke over the horizon. It cast a warm, golden light over the fields and the trees. For the first time in 3 weeks, the heavy fog was completely gone. Edward parked the truck in the driveway. He turned off the engine. He turned to look at me. The dark bags under his eyes were still there, but the dull, guarded look was gone. His eyes were bright again. They were full of warmth, life, and an eternal gratitude. He reached across the seat and took my hand. He pressed it to his lips. Thank you, Clara, he said. His voice was steady and peaceful. You saved me. I love you, Edward, I replied. We walked up the steps and entered our home. The house was no longer silent and heavy. Felt warm. Felt safe. The secret was gone, and the stone of our marriage was solid once again. We had faced the deepest darkness together, and we had brought the truth into the light.